Well, kia ora tātou, talofa lava, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Victoria Business School. My name is Bob Buckle. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor and Dean of Commerce at Victoria University of Wellington. We're privileged this evening on at least two counts. First of all, our speaker this evening is Professor Alan Auerbach, one of the world's leading authorities on public finance and taxation. Alan is the Robert Birch Professor of Economics and Law and Director of the Birch Centre for Tax Policy and Public Finance at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, has previously taught at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, and was Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Joint Committee on Taxation in 1992. And he's been a consultant to several government agencies in the United States and abroad. Alan is a former Vice President of the American Economics Association. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and the National Academy of Social Insurance, and is currently Vice President of the National Tax Association, from which he received the Daniel M. Holland Medal in 2011. Professor Auerbach is very appropriately the inaugural Robin Oliver Scholarship Visiting Lecturer in Tax Policy. We are therefore doubly privileged this evening because Alan will be delivering the inaugural lecture, the Robin Oliver Lecture. Who is Robin Oliver? Silly question for this audience, but Robin is with us this evening. Probably most of you have noticed that. And as most of you are aware, but for those of you who may not be aware, Robin is a leading tax policy advisor and has been to successive governments in New Zealand, initially with Treasury, then with the IRD, and now, of course, with Oliver Shaw. I've got that the right way around, haven't I, Robin? And he has been advisor to the OECD and the United Nations. He was recognised for his contributions to public policy by being awarded the New Zealand Order of Merit in the 2009 Queen's Birthday Honours. In addition to the Robin Oliver Lecture, IRD have established the Robin Oliver Tax Policy Scholarships, which have been initiated by Tax Management New Zealand to help continue New Zealand's leading role in the development of tax policy. And the objectives of the scholarships are threefold: to recognise Robin's 30 years of public service, leadership and tax policy, to encourage development of future tax policy leaders in New Zealand, and to support continuation of leading tax policy thinking in New Zealand. So those are the reasons why we're gathered here this evening, but in particular to listen to the inaugural Robin Oliver Lecture. And the title of Professor Auerbach's lecture this evening is a very appropriate one: International Tax Reviews and New Zealand's Tax Working Group. Robin, of course, was involved in the 2000-2001 review chaired by Rob McLeod, and he was involved in the 2009 Tax Working Group. And Alan Auerbach's eminently qualified to do this already. You've heard his background, his public policy and academic background, but he's actually been involved in tax reviews internationally, two of which he'll be talking about this evening: the Mirrlees Review and the Australian Tax Review chaired by Ken Henry. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Auerbach to deliver this evening's Robin Oliver Lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, very much for those kind words. And I also was involved in the McLeod Review, and I remember meeting Robin Oliver then. And one of the things I learned during my visit to Wellington, that was my last visit to Wellington 12 years ago, was that the Prime Minister most certainly did not favor taxation of owner-occupied housing. And I think that was, I learned when visiting Australia 2.5 years ago after the release of the Henry Review that there was not to be the kind of reform of natural resource taxation that the review had envisioned. So my association with reviews has taught me something about the interplay between tax policy and tax politics. And I will not be focusing on that very much this evening, although I will at one point talk about and come right back to this, how one should, in terms of putting a committee together, what one should be thinking about in terms of the aims of such a review. So as Bob suggested, I'm going to be talking about a comparison, trying to offer some comparative comments about these three recent reviews, the Tax Working Group's report here, as well as the Mirrlees Review, which was finally produced in 2011 in the UK under the auspices of the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, and the Henry Review, which was the committee chaired by Ken Henry, the Secretary of the Treasury in Australia. These are all contemporaneous reviews, and they have a lot in common. As you'll see, the bedrock, the principles of the reviews are quite similar and reflect, I think one could safely say, the current state of thinking about tax policy. That, of course, isn't the current state of thinking has evolved over the years, and indeed the Mirrlees Review was established with the very conscious intent of providing a comparison with the earlier review chaired by James Mead 30 years before that in the UK, the idea being what has happened in the last 30 years, both in terms of changes in the world as well as changes in academic thinking about what a good tax system looks like. And so that was very much intended as a sort of more of an academic exercise looking at how things have changed. Many of the differences in the reviews reflect differences in the intended scope and composition, but also, I think, differences in the countries where the reviews took place, and I'll try to say something about that as well. So let me get to that issue of composition and scope. These three reviews, although contemporaneous, came about in different ways, and some of the differences in what they suggest and what they focus on can be traced to that. The Mirrlees Review was the most academic of the three exercises. It was a group of, it occurred in two stages, a bunch of papers written by various scholars, and then a smaller group that put together the recommendations and tried to distill them into a series of actionable suggestions for the government. It was, so in a sense, it was meant to be practical, and indeed, at least one of the recommendations did find its way into British policy, but it was also very much tied to the academic literature. And so you might say it made fewer compromises in trying to think what might be realistic policy suggestions. It was certainly not an ivory tower exercise, and they did make compromises, but I think along the continuum between the pure academic point of view and the very applied approach based on what policy looks like, it was closer to the academic. The Henry Review and the Tax Working Group here both had much more government involvement. I mean, Henry was in the government, but even here, although Bob chaired the Tax Working Group and was not, it was in the private domain, nevertheless, there was obviously a lot of interaction with the government. And I think that shows in the Henry Review and the Tax Working Group report, much more focused on what might actually be done. I think probably the Tax Working Group the most of the three. It's hard to know where along this continuum is the best place to try to place a report? That is, should one try to adhere very rigorously to principles of sound policy, or should one take account of what's actually possible? Obviously, the extremes aren't that appealing. You want to have a little bit of both. I think perhaps the best compromise is where it's obvious that certain things can't happen, and you just have to deal with sort of more incremental changes. It's fine to suggest them, but I think it is useful to, when doing that, to make clear that this is a compromise and that this is maybe an improvement over current policy, but it's not the best way to do things, and that there are other ways. I would just as a mild criticism of the tax working group's analysis, I would say there's more of that in the Henry Review in terms of recommendations. That is, the recommendations, I would say, are as applied as those in the tax working group. I would say there's more in the Henry, a little bit more in the Henry Review, lamenting or at least noting that in the longer run there might be other ways of doing things. I'm sure that was in the minds of the people in the tax working group, and in some places it is in the report. So, as I said, it's only a mild criticism because I understand what the objective was in doing that. Now, one of the things that all three reports do, and it's understandable why they do it, is to separate the issue of tax structure versus tax revenue. It's a very useful distinction, because when the tax system changes, there's no reason to believe that changes in the tax system will keep revenue exactly the same. But in terms of thinking about an improved tax system, you can say what would a better tax structure be, and combining that with, say, an increase in revenues may confuse the two issues. And when people are thinking about the effects of the reform, their judgment may be clouded by the fact that revenue is higher, and of course higher revenue may have negative effects on the economy, and which you wouldn't want to attribute to the tax reform, to the change in tax structure itself. So for pedagogic reasons, it is useful to separate these things. But it's also important to realize that it's an artificial separation, that one of the reasons for adopting a tax reform might well be to make it easier to raise revenue in a less distortionary manner. And indeed, the tax working group and the Henry Review both note that changes in the economies of their respective countries and in the age structure of the population will inevitably lead to needs for greater revenue. Here's a picture from a recent Treasury document projecting New Zealand's revenues and expenditures, Crown revenues and expenditures, the green line being inclusive of interest of debt service, the middle line being expenditures excluding debt service, and the bottom line being revenue. And very nicely, these are all as a share of GDP, and the revenue line is very nicely horizontal, which is in the nature of projections when you project out beyond a point where you have any reason to believe you know anything. But what we do know from this picture, and if I didn't know where this came from, I wouldn't know what country it came from, because I have produced pictures like this for the United States, where the numbers aren't exactly the same. It's not exactly the same scale, but the difference between revenues and expenditures shows up. And you can do this for many countries, and the picture is very much the same. In fact, I'm going to give a talk at the Treasury tomorrow afternoon talking about such comparisons. So it's obvious that there's going to be has to be some realignment of revenues and expenditures, and it's certainly likely that some of that's going to come on the revenue side. So while it's useful for pedagogic purposes to separate the change in ways of changing the tax structure from ways of changing revenues, one should keep in mind that these things may very well go together and indeed are complementary. And in fact, it's not as easy to separate these things even pedagogically as I may have implied. And the reason for that is that the right tax structure to have depends on how much revenue you need. That is, if you're planning to raise 30% of GDP in revenue, you might want to use one tax system. And if you're planning to raise 40% of GDP in revenue, you might want to use a different tax system.